This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Torah's 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Shemot chapter 18. One of Rashi's recurring hermeneutical tools for interpreting the Torah operates under the principle of ein mukdam umuchar baTorah. There is no chronological order in the Torah. When I was a child in grade school, I remember being taught that the paradigmatic example to illustrate this principle was our chapter, Shemot chapter 18. Rashi argues that Yitro's visit does not chronologically take place at this narrative juncture, but rather occurs after Matan Torah, after the giving of the Torah at Sinai. In contrast, the Ramban disagrees, and he presents a simpler, perhaps more straightforward reading that the story appears in its proper chronological position and indeed did take place before Matan Torah. This interpretive dispute illuminates broader methodological principles which govern biblical exegesis, and it reveals sophisticated literary techniques that employed within a scriptural text. As a general hermeneutical principle, it's reasonable to assume that biblical narratives unfold in chronological sequence. Nevertheless, sometimes there is compelling textual evidence that necessitates recognition that certain episodes appear deliberately displaced from their temporal position. A paradigmatic example emerges in Shemot chapter 24, which details the covenant ceremony when Bnei Israel received the Torah. This narrative clearly precedes the legislative material contained in chapters 21 through 23, and yet is located after that material. Russian formalist literary theory provides a valuable analytic framework for understanding this phenomena. They differentiate between what they call fabula, meaning the chronological sequence of events as they actually transpire, versus the syuzhet, the artistic arrangement of the narrative elements within the text. Masterful storytelling frequently diverges from strict chronological presentation, occasionally prioritizing thematic coherence and interpretive effect over temporal linearity. After all, the Torah functions as theological literature rather than mere historical chronology. And so it makes sense that sometimes, indeed, the Torah would have stories out of order. Nevertheless, the overriding assumption should favor chronological order. In order to suggest that a narrative appears out of chronological sequence, one must answer two fundamental questions. First, what textual evidence demonstrates chronological displacement? And second, what theological or literary purpose motivates this rearrangement? The Yitro narrative presents a classic case study for examining these considerations. The case for chronological displacement rests on substantial textual foundations. Yitro's account of the judicial proceedings explicitly references Bnei Israel standing for judgment before Moshe and receiving instructions in divine ordinances. The text states that Moshe declares to Yitro, "Vehudati et chukei ha'Elohim v'torotav." I make known to the people God's statutes and his laws. If the revelation at Sinai has not yet occurred, then what comprehensive legal corpus is Moshe teaching? While some commentators propose that these refer to elementary ordinances received at Marah, such foundational statutes would prove insufficiently complex to require the extensive judicial apparatus which is described in this chapter. The sophisticated legal proceedings depicted strongly suggest a comprehensive legislative framework, such as the one detailed in Parshat Mishpatim, which encompasses dinim between individuals, meaning interpersonal tort law, precisely the type of adjudication that Moshe appears to be conducting. In terms of the rationale, the reason for this chronological displacement seems to be based on the Torah's employment of structural juxtaposition. By positioning the Yitro's narrative here, immediately following chapter 17, the Torah creates a powerful contrast between our chapter, the story of Yitro, and the story of the previous chapter, the story of Amalek. The two stories exhibit divergent responses to divine manifestation. Both stories tell the reaction of two nations who have heard what happened to Bnei Israel during their exodus from Egypt, and yet their responses are diametrically opposed. While Amalek responds through unprovoked attack, Yitro responds through praise and desire for integration. This same literary juxtaposition between Yitro and his descendants and the Amalekim appears elsewhere in the biblical literature. We encounter a similar structural parallel in Shmuel Aleph, where before Shaul attacks Amalek, he instructs the Keni, the descendants of Yitro, to separate from their geographical proximity. Once again, the two appear juxtaposed, suggesting that these people may have inhabited contiguous regions in southern Israel. This theological dimension of Amalek's assault emerges with crystalline clarity from the war's description. The conflict itself constitutes an attack against divine sovereignty, as evidenced by the declaration, Ki yad al kesia milchama Adonai ba'Amalek midor dor. For the hand is upon the throne of God, war for the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation. Calling the altar Hashem Nisi further emphasizes this cosmic dimension. This represents a theological warfare, not merely political aggression. In contrast, Yitro is the paradigmatic Gentile who recognizes divine sovereignty. The text emphasizes that Yitro heard, Vayishma Yitro et kol asher asa Elohim leMoshe u'Yisrael amo, all that God has done to Moshe and for Israel's people. And his response manifests as a recognition, Ata yadati ki gadol Adonai mikol ha'Elohim. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. However, in addition to the aforementioned theological recognition, I would add that there is another fundamental distinction between Amalek and Yitro, which transcends mere doctrinal acknowledgement. The Yitro narrative presents a unique literary feature that illuminates deeper moral principles. This distinction becomes particularly evident through the special relationship that is established between Moshe and Yitro. When Moshe and Yitro encounter each other in our chapter, the Hebrew text employs a deliberately ambiguous syntax. Vayitze Moshe likrat chotano. Moshe went out to greet his father-in-law. Vayishtachu vayishaklo. And he bowed down and he kissed him. Vayishalu ish l're'ehu l'shalom. And he asked his fellow for peace. Vayavo ha'olah. And came into the tent. The grammatical ambiguity here, concerning who bows and who initiates the kiss, creates an interpretive richness rather than a confusion. Moshe and Yitro appear almost synonymous within the scene. The linguistic flexibility here allows for multiple interpretive possibilities to exist. Whether on the one hand, Moshe is the one who demonstrates humility towards his elder, or conversely, it's Yitro who is honoring his son-in-law's stature. The dual meaning indicates a mutual covenant between these two figures. This same mutual covenant originates in their very first encounter. When Moshe flees his native Egypt and royal adopted status for Midian, he encounters Yitro's daughters experiencing harassment from local shepherds and intervenes decisively. When the daughters return home early, Yitro rebukes them for their lack of gratitude. Vayomer el benotav ve'ayo lama ze azavten et ha'ish. Where is this man? Why did you abandon him? Call him so that he make bread. Both Moshe and Yitro thus demonstrate behavior that diverges from prevailing social norms regarding treatment of the vulnerable in foreign elements. Moshe saves vulnerable women, and Yitro refuses to abandon the stranger. In this manner, both figures are united by exceptional moral sensitivity. This moral sensitivity becomes highlighted through a stark contrast with the treatment that Israel later receives from Moab and Ammon during their wilderness wanderings. We're told in the book of Devarim, Lo yavo Ammoni Moavi bikal Adonai ad olam, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall never enter the congregation of Israel, al devar asher lo kidmu etchem belechem v'mayim baderech, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way. The Talmud in Sanhedrin records, in fact, a statement from Rabbi Yochanan that encapsulates this distinction. While those who we are told that are distanced refers to Ammon and Moab, those who we are told to bring near are Yitro. This fundamental principle distinguishes those worthy of inclusion within God's congregation from those who merit exclusion. The willingness to provide sustenance to the vulnerable and foreign demonstrates the moral excellence that merits divine favor. All of this stands in stark contrast to Amalek, whose response to divine manifestation manifests as unprovoked aggression against the vulnerable, rather than protection and assistance. The juxtaposition of these narratives thus establishes a fundamental moral paradigm that transcends its immediate historical context and offers enduring instruction regarding the proper response to human need. Ultimately, whether you accept Rashi's chronological displacement or Ramban's straightforward reading, the essential message of the story remains the same. The fundamental distinction between peoples lies not in their ethnic identity or their theological sophistication, but in their moral response to those in need. Yitro and Moshe exemplify the path of righteousness through their treatment of the vulnerable, while Amalek represents the opposite choice, attacking rather than protecting those who cannot defend themselves. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.